Welcome to Calm Science Sleep, where quiet curiosity meets deep sleep. What if the most mysterious thing in the universe isn't a black hole or a distant galaxy, but the feeling of being you, right now in this moment, aware that you exist? Somewhere inside your skull, something extraordinary is happening. Neurons are firing in patterns too intricate to fully map. Chemicals are drifting across microscopic gaps. Electricity is rippling through tissue that looks, under a microscope, not entirely unlike a bowl of pale porridge. And out of all of that, somehow, something arises that no equation has ever fully captured. The quiet inner glow of awareness. The simple, undeniable fact that there is something it feels like to be alive. Scientists call this consciousness. And despite centuries of philosophy, decades of neuroscience, and some of the most brilliant minds in human history turning their full attention toward it, nobody has quite managed to explain how it happens. How does a brain, a physical object made of atoms and water and protein, give rise to the experience of a sunset, the ache of a memory, the soft comfort of a familiar voice? That question is what we're going to sit with tonight, gently, unhurriedly, in the way that this channel likes to move through the world. There's no pressure to remember any of this, no test waiting at the end. Just the slow, soft pleasure of wondering about something deeply strange, something that touches every moment of your existence without ever quite announcing itself. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your breath find its own rhythm, and let's begin at the very beginning, with the question itself. For most of human history, the question of where consciousness comes from wasn't really a scientific question at all. It was a religious one, a philosophical one, a poetic one. Ancient thinkers imagined the soul as something separate from the body, a kind of invisible passenger that arrived at birth and departed at death. The Greeks spoke of the psyche. The Egyptians imagined the heart, not the brain, as the seat of awareness. They were so convinced of this that when they mummified their dead, they carefully preserved organs like the liver and the heart, and scooped the brain out through the nose and discarded it entirely. The brain to them was something close to irrelevant. It took a long time for that view to change. Aristotle himself, one of the most careful and curious observers the ancient world produced, believed the heart was the center of sensation and feeling. He thought the brain served mainly as a kind of radiator cooling the blood. It's a charming idea, and an entirely wrong one, but it lingered in various forms for centuries. The first real hints that consciousness might have something to do with the brain came from injury and illness. Physicians began to notice that damage to the head could alter a person's personality, their memories, their very sense of self. A blow to the skull could steal language, or erase the ability to recognize faces, or make someone laugh uncontrollably at nothing at all. These observations were disturbing, but also deeply informative. They suggested that the mind wasn't floating freely above the body. It was somehow anchored in it, tied to it, dependent on it. Perhaps no single event made this point more dramatically than the case of Phineas Gage, a railroad construction foreman who in 1848 survived an accident that drove a large iron rod straight through his skull. The rod entered below his left cheekbone and exited through the top of his head. Remarkably, Gage survived. He was conscious within minutes, speaking coherently, walking with help to a nearby cart. But the man who returned to his friends and family after his recovery was, by all accounts, not quite the same man they had known. Before the accident, Gage had been described as responsible, efficient and well-liked. Afterward, he became impulsive, unpredictable, and prone to profanity. He struggled to maintain employment and never quite regained his former stability. His physician, John Harlow, would later write that the balance between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities had been destroyed. What Gage's story suggested was something quietly radical. That personality, character, the very texture of who a person is not separate from the brain. It lives there. It depends on specific regions and connections. Damage the brain in the right place and you don't just lose a memory or a skill. You lose something that feels much closer to the self. Cases like Gage's began to accumulate. Neurologists in the late 19th century mapped out regions of the brain responsible for speech and language. They found that damage to a particular area on the left side of the brain, now called Broca's area, could rob a person of the ability to speak fluently while leaving their understanding intact. Damage to a different region, now called Wernicke's area, could do the reverse, leaving speech flowing but emptied of meaning. The brain, it began to seem, was not a uniform mass but a landscape of specialized territories, each one responsible for some particular piece of the rich tapestry we call conscious experience. This mapping project has continued ever since, growing more detailed and more astonishing with every decade. We now know that different parts of the visual cortex respond to color, to motion, to faces, to shapes. We know that specific circuits in the frontal lobe are involved in planning and decision-making, while deeper structures handle emotion and memory. We know that your ability to recognize the face of someone you love involves a small region of the temporal lobe called the fusiform face area. Damage it, and faces become meaningless arrangements of features, indistinguishable from one another. The people you love are still there in front of you. But something that normally happens automatically, the warm flash of recognition, is simply gone. What all of this tells us is that consciousness is not some unified, indivisible thing. It has parts, it has components. It can be selectively dismantled piece by precisely located damage. Which raises a strange question. If you can remove the recognition of faces while leaving everything else intact, what exactly is consciousness? Is it the sum of all those pieces? Or is it something else? Something that arises when the pieces work together in just the right way? That is one of the oldest and hardest questions in all of neuroscience, and it has a name. It is called the hard problem of consciousness. The philosopher David Chalmers introduced this phrase in the 1990s, and it has stuck because it captures something genuinely difficult that other framings tend to slide past. Chalmers drew a distinction between what he called the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. Now, to be clear, the easy problems are not easy in the ordinary sense of the word. Explaining how the brain processes visual information, how it integrates signals from different senses, how it regulates attention, how it produces sleep and wakefulness, these are enormously complex scientific questions. Entire careers are devoted to them, but they are easy in a specific sense. They are the kind of questions that, in principle, can be answered by understanding the mechanisms involved. If you map the circuits, trace the signals, understand the chemistry, you can explain the behavior. The hard problem is different. Even if you understood every single mechanism perfectly, explained every circuit and every signal and every chemical with complete precision, there would still be a question left unanswered. Why does any of it feel like anything? When light of a certain wavelength enters your eye, signals travel through the optic nerve, reach the visual cortex, and are processed in ways we can describe in some detail. We can trace the path, we can measure the firing patterns, but why at the end of that cascade of physical events is there the experience of seeing red? Why isn't it all just processing, just information moving through a system, without any inequality, without anything it feels like from the inside? Philosophers have a word for these inequalities. They call them qualia: the redness of red, the sharpness of pain, the particular warmth of afternoon sunlight on your skin. These experiences have a felt quality, a texture that seems irreducible to mere information processing. And nobody, so far, has given a fully satisfying account of where they come from, or how they arise from physical processes. Some scientists and philosophers argue that the hard problem will eventually dissolve as our understanding improves, that what seems mysterious now will turn out to be explainable in terms of mechanisms, just as the apparent mystery of life dissolved once we understood biology at the molecular level. Others believe the hard problem points to something genuinely fundamental, something that can't be explained away by better neuroscience alone. Either way, the question sits at the center of consciousness research, like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Let's follow some of those ripples. One of the most influential scientific theories of consciousness in recent decades is called global workspace theory. It was developed by the psychologist Bernard Baers, drawing on earlier ideas from cognitive science, and it offers a way of thinking about consciousness that feels intuitive once you settle into it. The idea goes something like this. Imagine a large theatre. The stage is brightly lit. The audience sits in relative darkness. At any given moment, the spotlight on stage illuminates one thing, and that thing is visible to everyone in the audience. Meanwhile, backstage and in the wings, countless other activities are happening. Set changes, costume adjustments, actors preparing, none of it visible to the audience. The brain, according to global workspace theory, works a bit like that theatre. Most of what the brain does happens unconsciously, backstage. You're not aware of the fact that your cerebellum is constantly adjusting your balance, or that your brainstem is regulating your breathing, or that your immune system is quietly surveilling your body for pathogens. All of that happens in the dark. It's real, it's important, but it's not in the spotlight. Consciousness, in this view, is the spotlight. It's a global broadcast, a signal that goes out from a central workspace, primarily in the frontal and parietal areas of the brain, to the rest of the neural network. When information is broadcast in this way, it becomes available to many different systems simultaneously. It can be used for reasoning, for memory, for language, for planning. It enters awareness. It becomes something you know about, something you can act on, something that feels like experience. Neuroimaging studies have offered some support for this picture. When people become conscious of a stimulus, there's a characteristic burst of activity in frontal and parietal regions that doesn't occur when the same stimulus is processed unconsciously. It's as though a match is lit in the dark theatre of the brain, briefly illuminating the stage and sending a flicker of light into the audience. But global workspace theory, satisfying as it is in many respects, doesn't quite answer the hard problem. It explains what consciousness does. It tells us something about how information becomes globally available, about the architecture of the workspace, but it doesn't fully explain why any of that should feel like something, why the spotlight should have a quality of experience attached to it rather than simply being a functional state with no inner life. Another theory takes a different approach. It's called integrated information theory, and it was developed by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. Integrated information theory, often abbreviated as IIT, is in some ways the most ambitious attempt so far to give a precise mathematical account of consciousness. And it begins with an intuition that feels quite natural. The idea is that consciousness is identical to integrated information. Specifically, consciousness is identical to what Tononi calls V, a measure of how much more information a system generates as a whole than the sum of its parts would generate independently. A system with high phi, one where the parts are richly interconnected in ways that create information that couldn't be predicted from any subset of the parts alone, is highly conscious. A system with low phi is barely conscious or not conscious at all. This might sound abstract, but the intuition behind it is elegant. Think about your experience right now, what you're hearing and what you're feeling, and the sense of where you are in space. All of that seems to be unified. It comes to you as a single, integrated experience, not as a collection of separate, disconnected pieces. Even the simplest conscious moment seems to have this quality of wholeness, of binding. Integrated information theory suggests that this binding is precisely what consciousness is. The fact that the brain generates enormous amounts of information that arise from its specific pattern of connections, information that couldn't be reduced to the activity of any individual region. One of the most striking aspects of integrated information theory is its implications for what might be conscious and what might not. Under this framework, consciousness isn't exclusively a human or animal thing. Any system with sufficiently high phi would have some degree of experience. A thermostat, which simply registers hot or cold without much integration, would have essentially no consciousness. But a system with rich, densely interconnected information processing might have a significant degree of inner experience, even if it doesn't look anything like a brain. The theory also has implications for artificial intelligence, which we'll come back to later. And it generates predictions that, in principle, can be tested, which gives it more scientific grip than purely philosophical accounts. Though testing it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult in practice, not everyone is convinced by integrated information theory. Critics have pointed out that some of its predictions seem counterintuitive, that it struggles to explain certain features of conscious experience, and that phi is practically impossible to calculate for anything as complex as the human brain. But as a framework, it represents one of the most serious mathematical attempts to grapple with consciousness as a real phenomenon in the physical world. Now let's slow down for a moment and consider something that often gets overlooked in discussions of consciousness: sleep. We spend roughly a third of our lives unconscious, or at least profoundly altered in our awareness, and this turns out to be extraordinarily revealing. What happens to consciousness during sleep? The answer is more nuanced than it might seem. During deep, dreamless sleep, what researchers call slow-wave sleep, there is a dramatic reduction in the kind of coordinated, integrated brain activity that seems to accompany conscious experience. The neurons are still active, very much so. The brain is doing important work during slow-wave sleep, clearing metabolic waste, consolidating memories, regulating hormones. But the pattern of activity changes. The elaborate synchronized communication across distant brain regions that characterizes waking experience seems to break down. Different regions of the brain fall into a kind of local oscillation, each doing its own thing, less interconnected with the rest. This is consistent with integrated information theory's predictions. When integration breaks down, when the whole is no longer generating more information than its parts, consciousness dims or disappears, and that's precisely what happens in deep sleep. You're not there. Not gone, but absent from experience in a way that sleep has no memory of, no continuity with, no felt sense of duration. And then something remarkable happens. The brain shifts into REM sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement, and dreaming begins. And in dreaming, a form of consciousness returns. A strange, internally generated consciousness, vivid and emotionally charged with its own logic and its own rules, unconstrained by the sensory input that ordinarily anchors waking experience. What this tells us is that consciousness doesn't require external input. It can generate itself from within. The dreaming brain is, in a sense, creating its own reality, its own experience, drawing on memories and emotions and narrative patterns to construct a world that feels completely real while it's happening. Only on waking, if you wake at all, does the boundary between dream and reality reassert itself. This internal generation of experience is one of the most fascinating aspects of consciousness. It suggests that what we call reality is always, to some significant degree, a construction. The brain doesn't passively receive information from the world and report it faithfully. It actively builds a model, a simulation, a story, using incoming signals as the raw material but doing an enormous amount of interpretation, prediction, and filling in along the way. The neuroscientist Anil Seth has written beautifully about this idea. He describes conscious experience as a kind of controlled hallucination, a prediction machine running constantly, generating a model of the world and updating it when new sensory information doesn't quite fit. In this view, what you experience as reality isn't the world as it is. It's the brain's best guess about the world, shaped by expectation, shaped by prior experience, shaped by the body's needs and the brain's particular architecture. The fact that this model is usually very accurate is a tribute to millions of years of evolution. But the fact that it can break down in dreams, in psychosis, in certain drug states, in sensory deprivation, reveals its constructed nature. The brain is always telling a story. Most of the time, the story matches the world closely enough that we never notice the gap. But the gap is always there. This raises a genuinely unsettling question. How much of your moment-to-moment experience is directly determined by what's actually happening in the world, and how much is being quietly supplied by your own brain, filling in details, smoothing over inconsistencies, generating the feeling of a continuous, coherent self? More than we usually like to think is the honest answer. Let's think about attention for a moment, because it's one of the places where the constructed nature of consciousness becomes most visible. There's a famous demonstration, well known in psychology, in which participants are asked to watch a video of people passing a basketball and to count the number of passes. While they're focused on this task, a person in a gorilla costume walks through the scene, thumps their chest, and walks off. Most participants, somewhere between half and two-thirds in typical demonstrations, never notice the gorilla at all. Not because they're looking away. The gorilla is right there in plain sight, but because their attention is directed elsewhere, and the brain, remarkably, simply doesn't process what falls outside the spotlight of attention. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett has argued that this kind of finding has deep implications for how we understand consciousness. He's suggested that the apparent richness and detail of conscious experience is, to a significant extent, an illusion. We feel as though we see a complete, detailed, coherent visual world, but most of that richness is being confabulated, filled in by the brain based on what it expects to see, rather than what it has actually processed in detail. This isn't a comfortable idea. It challenges the intuitive sense that consciousness is exactly what it presents itself as, a clear window onto the world and onto the self. But the evidence for it is substantial. We are, in some deep sense, much less aware of the world than we feel we are. And what we are aware of is more constructed, more interpretive, more shaped by expectation and prior belief than it appears from the inside. That said, This view has its critics. Some philosophers of mind argue that Dennett underestimates what consciousness actually is, that there's something irreducible about the felt quality of experience that can't simply be explained away by pointing to the brain's tendency to fill things in. The debate is alive and it's interesting, and the truth likely lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, a place where experience is both real and constructed, both given and made. One of the most striking observations about consciousness is how it relates to the body. We tend to think of consciousness as a product of the brain, something that happens upstairs, above, and separate from the messy physical machinery of the body. But this isn't quite right. Your body shapes your consciousness in ways that are constant and profound. The slow, steady rhythm of your heartbeat pulses upward through the vagus nerve and into the brain, influencing the timing of neural oscillations and even shaping the content of thought. The gut, as we discussed in another episode of this channel, contains an enormous number of neurons and sends a continuous stream of signals upward to the brain, influencing mood, anxiety, and even the clarity of thinking. Hormones coursing through the bloodstream alter brain chemistry, and, with it, the quality of experience. Even the position of the body matters. Research has shown that posture affects emotional state, that facial expressions influence the emotional quality of experience, that the feeling of being warm or cold bleeds into social judgments about warmth and coldness in other people. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, writing in the mid-20th century, argued that consciousness is fundamentally embodied, that the mind is not a disembodied observer peering out through the senses, but something deeply entangled with the whole lived body. We don't have bodies the way we have cars. We are our bodies. And the consciousness that arises from that arrangement is always already shaped by the particular kind of body we inhabit. This perspective has gained considerable traction in recent decades, as researchers have found more and more evidence for what they call embodied cognition. The idea that thinking, feeling, and perceiving are not purely cerebral activities but are deeply influenced by, and in some sense enacted through the body as a whole. You don't just think with your brain, you think with your hands, with your gut, with the rhythm of your walking, with the particular texture of the world as your body moves through it. There is something deeply comforting in this view. It anchors consciousness in the world rather than lifting it into some separate ghostly realm. It makes experience something lived and embodied rather than something purely cognitive, something felt in the bones as much as in the neurons, and it may offer part of the answer to the mystery of consciousness. Not by dissolving the mystery, but by locating it differently, in the whole organism living in the world rather than in the isolated brain floating in its skull. Now let's turn to something that has fascinated researchers and troubled philosophers in equal measure: the question of the self. Most of us, most of the time, have a strong, largely unquestioned sense of being a self. A continuous, unified individual who persists through time, who has a past, who anticipates a future, who is the same person who went to bed last night and woke up this morning. This sense of self feels bedrock, obvious, simply given. It feels like the most certain thing there is. Descartes, in the 17th century, stripped away everything he could doubt and found that the one thing he couldn't doubt was the fact that he was doubting. I think, therefore I am. The self seemed to him the most undeniable reality available. But neuroscience has been quietly, persistently chipping away at this certainty. Consider what happens to the sense of self in certain neurological conditions. Patients with a condition called depersonalization disorder describe feeling detached from their own thoughts, feelings, and body, as though they're watching themselves from the outside, as though the self is an observer witnessing experience rather than the experiencer itself. Patients with certain kinds of brain damage can lose the ability to recognize themselves in a mirror, seeing the reflection as a stranger. People in the advanced stages of dementia can lose not just memories, but the sense of continuous identity that ties those memories together into a coherent life story. And in meditation traditions spanning thousands of years, practitioners have described experiences in which the sense of self temporarily dissolves. Not as a loss, not as something frightening, but as a kind of expansion, a recognition that what seemed to be a bounded, separate individual is actually more like a process, a temporary pattern, rather than a permanent thing. The Buddhist tradition in particular has long maintained that the self is not a fixed entity but a construction, something assembled moment by moment from experience, something that has no solid center when examined closely enough. Modern neuroscience is beginning to approach a compatible view. There is a network in the brain, sometimes called the default mode network, that becomes particularly active during self-referential thought, during rumination, during daydreaming, during the kind of mental activity in which you're thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your relationships. This network seems to be closely related to the construction and maintenance of the sense of self. Interestingly, this network tends to quiet down during intense focused attention on external tasks. When you're deeply engaged in something, absorbed in a problem or a piece of music or a conversation that has fully captured your interest, the self-referential chatter of the default mode network diminishes. The self steps back. Many people describe these states of absorption as among the most satisfying experiences available. There is a freedom in them, a lightness that ordinary self-conscious awareness doesn't quite offer. And the experience of flow, described so richly by the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, is characterized precisely by this temporary dissolution of self-consciousness. The dancer lost in a performance, the climber moving through rock, the writer carried away by a sentence. In these states, the usual sense of a self standing, apart from experience, seems to thin and fade, and what's left is pure activity, pure presence, pure aliveness. This suggests something interesting. The self, rather than being the ground of consciousness, the thing that consciousness belongs to, might be something more like a recurring story that consciousness tells about itself. Not the experiencer, but a piece of the experience, a narrative, a model, a useful fiction that the brain generates to coordinate behavior and plan for the future. Not nothing, not an illusion in the dismissive sense, but also not quite what it presents itself as. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his life exploring what it means for a person to persist through time, whether the self has the kind of deep, essential reality we usually attribute to it, and what it might mean to let go of that assumption. He concluded, after years of careful reflection, that what he called the reductionist view of personal identity, the view that there is no deep further fact about a person's identity beyond the physical and psychological continuity, was not just intellectually defensible, but actually liberating. When he stopped believing in a deep essential self, he found that his life felt lighter, more like the world after a heavy snowfall, quiet and open. There's something in that thought that feels appropriate for a late-night reflection. The self that you carry through the day that worries about tomorrow and reviews today, that feels so solid and continuous and necessary, is perhaps something softer than it appears. Not an illusion to be discarded, but a habit to be held more lightly. A story that your brain finds useful but that doesn't need to be taken quite so seriously. Let's consider the role of memory in all of this, because it's deeply connected to the sense of self and to consciousness more broadly. Memory is often described as the way the past persists into the present, but this framing makes memory sound more stable and reliable than it actually is. When you remember something, you're not retrieving a stored recording, a fixed impression of the past that has been sitting in the brain's archive waiting to be played back. You're reconstructing. The act of remembering is an active, creative process, drawing on fragments of neural trace and reshaping them in light of current knowledge, current emotion, current context. The psychologist Frederick Bartlett demonstrated this beautifully almost a century ago. He had participants read a Native American folktale and then asked them to reproduce it from memory at various intervals. What he found was that people didn't simply forget details over time. They systematically distorted the story, replacing unfamiliar elements with more culturally familiar ones, rounding off the edges, imposing conventional narrative shapes on material that didn't quite fit. Memory wasn't passive recall. It was active reconstruction, shaped by expectation. We now know that memories can change each time they're retrieved, a process called reconsolidation. When a memory is reactivated, it briefly becomes malleable again, susceptible to modification by whatever is happening in the brain at that moment. In principle, this means that memories are not fixed points in the past but living things, capable of shifting and morphing with each revisiting. This has unsettling implications for the self, which depends on memory for its sense of continuity. If the memories that tie your present self to your past self are themselves constantly being revised, quietly updated, imperceptibly edited, then what exactly is the continuity of the self? Is it the persistence of the same pattern, a similar pattern, a story that the brain keeps telling, with revisions about a character it calls you. The neurologist Antonio Damasio has offered a framework that bears on this question. He distinguishes between what he calls the proto-self, which is the brain's moment-to-moment representation of the body's state, a kind of biological baseline, the core self, which is a transient sense of self that arises when the proto-self interacts with an object or event in the world, and the autobiographical self, which is the extended narrative identity that draws on memory and projects into the future. In this view, consciousness is layered. The simplest forms of experience involve the body's homeostatic state. More complex forms arise from the moment-to-moment encounter between the organism and the world, and the richest, most narrative form of self-consciousness arises from the integration of memory and future projection into a story of a life. Damage different layers and you disrupt consciousness in different ways. Damage to the brainstem can eliminate consciousness entirely. Damage to the hippocampus can preserve moment-to-moment awareness while destroying the ability to form new autobiographical memories, producing a person who is fully present in each moment but unable to stitch those moments into a continuous narrative. Damage to the frontal lobes can impair the ability to project into the future, the ability to plan, to imagine, to hold a self in time. Each of these disruptions is a window into the architecture of consciousness. Each one reveals a piece of the structure that normally hums along invisibly beneath the ordinary experience of being a person in the world. There's one more territory we should visit before we let the mind soften towards sleep. It's the territory of what's sometimes called altered states of consciousness, states that lie outside the ordinary waking awareness most people spend their days in. Dreams, as we've touched on, are one such state, and they're remarkable precisely because they show that consciousness can generate a complete, convincing world from entirely internal sources. The dreaming mind doesn't know it's dreaming. It inhabits the dream as fully and unself-consciously as the waking mind inhabits waking life. Only on waking, in that brief liminal moment of return, does the reality of the dream dissolve and the ordinary waking world reassert itself. Meditation offers another window. Long-term meditators, studied by neuroscientists using brain imaging, show measurable differences in the structure and function of their brains compared to non-meditators. Regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-referential processing are altered by sustained practice, and meditators' reports of their experience, gathered over thousands of hours of practice, offer a detailed phenomenology, a careful map of the territory of consciousness that neuroscience is only beginning to verify from the outside. Richard Davidson and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin have worked extensively with Tibetan Buddhist monks who have accumulated tens of thousands of hours of meditation practice. What they found was extraordinary. During certain meditative states, these practitioners showed levels of gamma wave synchrony, a particular kind of high-frequency, synchronized brain activity that were unlike anything previously recorded in healthy adults. The intensity and coherence of the signal was unprecedented. Whether this means the meditators were experiencing something profoundly different, or whether the brain activity reflects something about the nature of those particular states, remains an open question. But the finding is striking. The brain can apparently reach states that fall entirely outside the ordinary range, states that arise not from injury or illness, but from sustained, intentional practice. Psychedelic compounds have also become subjects of serious scientific inquiry in recent decades, after a long period of neglect following the cultural turbulence of the 1960s. Researchers at institutions like Johns Hopkins University and Imperial College London have been carefully studying the effects of substances like psilocybin, the active compound in certain mushrooms, and have found that these substances produce profound, often lasting changes in consciousness and in well-being. Under the influence of psilocybin, the default mode network, that self-referential network we discussed earlier, shows marked reduction in activity. And this reduction is correlated with what users describe as ego dissolution, a temporary but vivid experience in which the normal sense of being a bounded self seems to fall away, replaced by a feeling of unity, of connection, of the boundaries between self and world becoming permeable or absent. Many participants describe these experiences as among the most meaningful of their lives, and follow-up studies have found that a single carefully supported experience can produce lasting reductions in depression and anxiety, lasting increases in openness and creativity, and remarkably, lasting reductions in fear of death. The question of how the temporary disruption of a particular brain network can produce such durable changes is itself a fascinating, scientific puzzle. What the study of altered states reveals, broadly, is that ordinary waking consciousness, the state most of us spend most of our time in, is not the only form consciousness can take. It's a particular mode, a particular configuration, one that's extraordinarily useful for navigating the social and physical world, but that doesn't exhaust the possibilities of experience. The space of possible conscious states appears to be vastly larger than our everyday experience would suggest, and in exploring those edges, we learn something about the centre. Now let's take a moment to sit with some of the most profound open questions. Does consciousness require a biological brain? Or could it arise in other kinds of systems? This is not just a philosophical puzzle, it has become urgently practical as artificial intelligence has grown increasingly sophisticated. Large language models, the kind that can hold conversations, write poetry, translate languages and solve complex problems, are beginning to behave in ways that can seem, from the outside, quite like the behaviour we associate with minded beings. They respond to context, adapt to conversation, generate creative outputs that feel, sometimes, genuinely novel. But behaviour, however sophisticated, is not the same as experience. The hard problem sits here too, perhaps more sharply than anywhere. Even if a system behaves in every way like a conscious being, the question of whether there is something it feels like to be that system, whether there is any inner light, remains open. And it may be unanswerable from the outside. Integrated information theory, as we discussed, suggests that consciousness depends on the particular pattern of information integration, on phi, not on the material that does the integration. Under this view, silicon could in principle be conscious, if it were organised in the right way. But current artificial systems, which are typically organised in quite different ways from biological neural networks, would likely have very low phi and therefore very little or no conscious experience. Others disagree. The philosopher John Searle famously argued through what he called the Chinese room thought experiment that no matter how sophisticated the symbol manipulation in a system, this alone could never produce genuine understanding, genuine consciousness. Processing syntax, he argued, is not the same as grasping semantics. Shuffling symbols is not the same as meaning them. The debate continues. And perhaps what's most honest to say is that we don't yet understand consciousness well enough to know whether it could arise in non-biological systems. We can't fully explain how it arises in biological systems. So extending that explanation to other substrates remains speculation, however interesting. What we can say is that the question matters. As artificial systems become more capable, as we build entities that can carry on sustained relationships, that can adapt and learn, that can produce outputs that seem to reflect something like a perspective, the ethical stakes of the question of machine consciousness become real. If a system genuinely experiences something, then how we treat it matters in a moral sense. If it doesn't, then however convincing its performance of experience might be, it's a very sophisticated simulation without an inner life. Getting that distinction right seems important, and we don't yet have the tools to make it confidently. There is another enormous open question hovering at the edge of consciousness science, one that is almost too large to look at directly. It's the question of whether consciousness is something that brains produce, the way kidneys produce urine, something that arises from and is fully contained within the physical, or whether it has some more fundamental status in the universe. The physicalist position, which is the default position of most working scientists, holds that consciousness is a product of brain activity. Full stop. When the brain stops working, consciousness ends. The inner life is generated by and fully dependent on the physical machinery. But there are serious philosophers, and even some scientists who question whether this picture is complete. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness, or something like it, is a fundamental feature of the universe rather than a product of complex biological systems, has attracted renewed interest in recent years. It's associated with philosophers like Galen, Strawson, Philip Goff, and to varying degrees the physicist Roger Penrose. The idea is that rather than consciousness being a mysterious emergent property of matter, matter itself has some basic experiential quality, and what we recognise as rich, complex consciousness in humans and animals is what happens when those basic experiential properties are organised in sufficiently integrated and complex ways. Panpsychism sounds exotic, and it has serious problems. Chief among them is what's called the combination problem. Even if electrons or atoms have some minimal experiential property, it's far from clear how the specific, unified, rich experience of a human being could arise from combining vast numbers of those elementary experiences. But as a framework, it at least takes seriously the fact that explaining how consciousness arises from matter is genuinely hard, and it suggests that perhaps the difficulty comes from having started with the wrong picture of what matter is. Roger Penrose, together with the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, has proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, sometimes abbreviated as ORC-OR, which suggests that consciousness arises from quantum mechanical processes occurring inside structures in neurons called microtubules. Most neuroscientists are skeptical, finding the brain too warm and wet and noisy an environment for the delicate quantum effects Penrose and Hameroff invoke. But the theory represents a serious attempt to locate consciousness within a physical framework while taking seriously the idea that the physical framework itself might need to be expanded beyond classical mechanics to accommodate it. None of these ideas has yet achieved the kind of empirical confirmation that would make it genuinely settled science. Consciousness research remains a field in which bold speculation and careful empirical work sit side by side, each keeping the other honest. The experiments are real, the data are real, but the interpretations remain deeply contested. And that contestation, while sometimes frustrating, is also a sign that the questions are real, that they bite, that they resist easy resolution. And perhaps that's appropriate. If consciousness is the thing through which all other questions are asked, it makes a kind of sense that it would resist being neatly answered by those same questions. Let's come back to something quieter, something more personal. The mystery of consciousness isn't just a scientific puzzle or a philosophical problem. It's the mystery of your own existence, the mystery that hums in the background of every moment of your life. Right now, as you lie here listening, something is happening. Signals are travelling through your auditory cortex. Memories and associations are activating quietly in the background. The rhythm of your breathing is being registered somewhere in the brainstem. Your body is carrying out thousands of processes you'll never be aware of. And somewhere in and through all of that, something is present. Something is hearing these words. Something is here. That something is you, in the most immediate and undeniable sense. Whatever consciousness is, wherever it comes from, however it arises from the physical or exists as something more fundamental, the fact of it is the most certain thing available. More certain than the external world, more certain than other minds, more certain than science itself. Because science is only possible at all because there is consciousness to do the observing. René Descartes found that certainty and tried to build an entire system of knowledge from it. The system proved unstable in various ways, but the starting point was sound. I am aware. This, whatever it is happening. That much cannot be doubted from the inside. The American psychologist William James, writing at the end of the 19th century, described consciousness as a stream, a flowing river rather than a series of discrete snapshots, always moving, always changing, always continuous. He was struck by the way consciousness seems to carry with it the feel of transition, of movement between states, a sense of direction, of becoming rather than just being. The feeling of nearly remembering something, the feeling of a thought on the tip of the tongue. These transitional states, so familiar and yet so hard to describe, seem to James to be as real and important as the clearer moments of definite experience. There's something in that river, metaphor that feels right for falling asleep. As the mind begins to soften and the edges of thoughts become less defined, as the sharp, deliberate quality of waking attention gives way to the more fluid, associative quality of the hypnagogic state, that strange borderland between waking and sleeping, the stream of consciousness changes its character. It doesn't stop. It doesn't simply switch off. It shifts, becomes more dreamlike, more imagistic, less tethered to the logic and sequence of waking life. Many of history's most creative thinkers have deliberately cultivated that borderland. Salvador Dali, the surrealist painter, would sit in a chair holding a heavy key in his hand, hovering on the edge of sleep. As he drifted off and his muscles relaxed, the key would drop, clattering to the floor and jolting him back into wakefulness with vivid, half-formed imagery from the edge of sleep. He harvested those images for his paintings. Thomas Edison reportedly did something similar with a steel ball bearing. The scientist Nikola Tesla would visualize problems with extraordinary vividness in that same liminal state, and sometimes wake with solutions. The poet Edgar Allan Poe wrote about the hypnagogic state with great intensity, describing it as the verge of sleep, a region of absolute imagination. Whatever consciousness is, the creative mind seems instinctively to prize the states where its ordinary organizing logic softens, where the self relaxes its grip, where the stream flows more freely and makes unexpected connections. And sleep is perhaps the deepest version of that softening. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker has written extensively about the role of sleep in creativity, noting that during REM sleep the brain makes associations between distantly related concepts that the waking mind, too focused on the immediate and the practical, tends to miss. The famous examples are many. The chemist Auguste Kekulé dreamed of a snake seizing its own tail, and woke with the insight that the benzene molecule formed a ring. The mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan attributed many of his extraordinary theorems to visions that came to him in dreams, delivered, he believed, by the goddess of his family's devotion. Paul McCartney heard the melody of Yesterday complete in a dream, and was so convinced it must be someone else's tune that he spent weeks asking friends if they recognized it, before accepting that it had come from him. The sleeping mind doesn't just consolidate what the waking mind has done. It continues working, in its own idiom, making connections, resolving contradictions, generating images and stories that sometimes illuminate things the waking mind couldn't quite reach. And all of this, every dream, every insight at the edge of sleep, every moment of creative vision, and every moment of ordinary waking experience flows through the same mysterious medium. The one we've been circling around all night. The one that still, after all the neuroscience and all the philosophy and all the brilliant minds that have turned their attention to it, retains something irreducible, something that refuses to be fully captured in any equation or any diagram: consciousness. The thing that allows you to hear these words, the thing that turns the physical world into the experienced world, the quiet miracle that's happening right now, even as you begin to drift. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a famous essay in 1974 called "What is it like to be a bat?" He argued that no amount of objective, third-person knowledge about how bats navigate using echolocation could tell you what it is like, from the inside, to experience the world through echolocation. There is something it is like to be a bat, he insisted, some subjective character to bat experience, and no external description of the bat's neuroscience or behaviour could capture that. The subjective point of view resists objective description. We might say something similar about sleep. There is something it is like to fall asleep, something it is like to hover in that warm, heavy borderland where the day's last thoughts drift loose of their moorings and begin to float, something it is like when finally they let go entirely. What happens to consciousness then? Where does it go? Maybe it doesn't go anywhere. Maybe it simply changes form, softening from the bright, articulate awareness of waking into the darker, more fluid awareness of dreaming, and then into something quieter. Still, something below the level of narrative or memory, a kind of presence without an experiencer, a warmth without an observer. Or maybe something else happens, something science hasn't yet found the language for. The honest answer is that we don't fully know, and that not knowing, rather than being a frustration, might be something to rest in. The question is alive, the mystery is genuine, and the fact that you're here, wondering about it, is itself a piece of the answer. Consciousness wondering about itself is still consciousness. The stream doesn't stop flowing when you look at it. What we do know is this: every morning something remarkable happens. You wake up, the lights come on again, the self reconstitutes itself, drawing on memory and sensation, and the familiar architecture of a body that has been lying still and breathing through the night. And you are once more present, here, aware. The most ordinary miracle there is. Tonight, as the stream slows and the thoughts soften and the day recedes, you're witnessing that miracle in reverse. The lights are dimming, the stream is slowing, the self is letting go of its firm edges and dissolving back into something larger and quieter. And wherever consciousness goes in those hours between waking and waking again, it's following a path it has taken 10,000 times before. Whatever this strange, luminous thing we call experience is made of, it seems to know how to find its way home. 100 discoveries tonight, each one quietly extraordinary. 100 fragments of the mystery of what it means to be aware. A brain that generates its own reality. A self that is more a story than a substance. A stream that never truly stops. even when it seems to go underground. A question so deep that the greatest minds in history have stood at its edge and come away with wonder rather than certainty. That wonder is not a failure, it's a recognition. The universe has produced in you something capable of being astonished by its own existence. That astonishment is itself a form of understanding, perhaps the deepest form available. Let your breath slow now. Let the thoughts become less precise. Let the edges of things soften. The mystery isn't going anywhere. It will be here tomorrow, patient as it always is, ready to be wondered at again. But for now, the mind has done its work. The stream has carried you far enough. If this quiet journey through the mystery of consciousness has given you something to carry into your dreams, I'd be so grateful if you left a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help more than you might imagine, and it lets me know that these long, slow journeys into the deep are finding the people who need them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for wondering. Sleep well.